I've always been a light sleeper, but ever since I moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, my nights have been filled with an eerie restlessness. My eyes would flit open to the barest hint of movement, my ears tuned to the faintest whisper of sound. At first, I attributed it to the unfamiliarity of the new house, the new neighborhood. That was until I noticed my neighbor. George was his name, an affable man who lived in the house next door. An unassuming fellow, he seemed like the harmless embodiment of suburban normalcy. But there was one thing that was odd about George: his gardening habits. I remember the first time I saw him. It was around 2 a.m., and a rustling sound had stirred me from my sleep. I peered out of my window, and there he was, toiling away in his garden under the dim glow of the porch light. His back hunched, his hands were buried in the earth as he worked with an unsettling urgency. Over the following nights, I found myself fixated on George's nocturnal gardening. The sight of him hunched over his flower beds in the dead of night became an enigma that gnawed at me, a peculiar anomaly in our otherwise unremarkable suburb. One evening, I decided to investigate. I told myself it was my sleep-deprived brain conjuring up mysteries where there were none, that I was turning George, the harmless gardener, into George, the ominous nocturnal figure. I assured myself that once I knew what he was planting, this obsession would end, and I would finally sleep. With a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, I wandered over to George's house the next evening under the pretense of a friendly neighborhood visit. His house, much like him, was plain and unassuming. A perfectly trimmed lawn, a porch adorned with wind chimes, and the garden. The garden that came alive under the moon's gaze. George welcomed me with a kind smile and a hearty laugh, brushing off my apologies for the late visit. We chatted about the weather, the neighborhood, mundane things. All the while, my eyes kept straying to the garden. Finally, I mustered up the courage to ask, "George, why do you garden at night?" George paused, a strange glint in his eyes. He chuckled.
"Oh, the flowers I plant, they're a rare breed. They bloom best when planted under the moonlight."
A chill ran down my spine, a sense of dread slowly creeping in, but I pushed it away, laughing at my own absurd fears. I decided to put an end to my sleepless curiosity once and for all. The night was unusually dark when I ventured out, a cool breeze causing me to shiver. I peered into George's garden, my heart pounding in my chest. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated the patch of earth George had been tirelessly working on. I stepped closer, my eyes straining to see. I saw the freshly turned earth, a stark contrast against the well-kept grass. The soil was loose and soft, and I knelt down to examine it, curiosity overwhelming my sense of trepidation. My fingers brushed against something solid, something that didn't belong. Holding my breath, I started to dig around the object. It wasn't a stone or a root as one might expect in a garden. The object was smooth, plastic-like. As I unearthed more of it, a chilling realization washed over me. It was a finger. A human finger. A gasp escaped my lips, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I stumbled back, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just found. The finger was pale, detached, and very real. The reality of it was a cold, harsh slap to my face. I stumbled back from the garden, my mind reeling. George. Kind, gardening at night George. The pieces fell into place, the late-night digging, the unassuming persona, the secretive nocturnal activities. The horror was not in some supernatural creature, but in the man next door, hiding behind the mask of normalcy. Suddenly, the porch light flared brighter, illuminating the garden, and me, kneeling by the open earth with the severed finger. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The back door creaked open, and there was George, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher.
"Can't sleep either, neighbor?"
His voice cut through the chilling silence, calm and steady. It was almost as if he didn't notice the gruesome discovery in my hands. The sight of George, his silhouette standing tall in the doorway, sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my veins. I was caught, knee-deep in his horrifying secret, and the affable man next door had turned into a nightmarish figure. I stuttered, my mind racing for an explanation, a way out. But words failed me. The severed finger felt heavy in my hand, a grim reminder of the reality I was in. A slow, knowing smile spread across George's face. He stepped forward, the porch light casting long, grotesque shadows on the ground.
"You found my special flowers,"
he said, his voice taking on a dark, chilling tone. His words echoed in my ears as I scrambled to my feet, backing away. But I didn't run. Paralyzed by fear and shock, I watched as George stepped into the garden. He knelt by the disturbed earth, picked up the severed finger, and regarded it almost affectionately.
"We all have our hobbies, don't we?"
He chuckled, turning his gaze back to me. The glint in his eyes was not of a man caught, but of one enjoying a well-guarded secret shared. "George." My voice was barely a whisper, fear constricting my throat. I was a statue, unable to tear my gaze away from the macabre scene unfolding before me. He hummed in response, his attention still on the finger, now partially buried again in the soft earth.
"You see, these flowers of mine, they need special care. A specific fertilizer, if you will."
A sickening realization dawned upon me. His garden. It wasn't just a garden. It was a graveyard, a sanctuary for his grotesque pastime. "George, you need help," I managed to say, my voice shaky. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor.
"Help? No, neighbor. I'm just fulfilling a need. The need to control, to dominate. We can't always control life, but death. Death is a different matter."
His words were a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, a chilling testament to the horrors that lurked beneath the surface of normalcy. I was sharing the quiet with a monster, and the suburban dream was now a waking nightmare.
"Go home, neighbor,"
George said finally, breaking the tense silence.
"And remember, we all have our little secrets."
I turned and fled, the echoes of his words following me into the night. The sleepless nights took on a new meaning, the darkness filled with terrors I couldn't erase. The following days were a blur. The once peaceful neighborhood now felt like a stage for a horror show, with George as the lead actor. The sunlit normalcy of the day gave way to an all-consuming dread as night fell. The sight of George tending to his garden under the moonlight was a chilling reminder of the grim secret I had uncovered. I kept to myself, avoiding George and his garden. But the fear, the knowledge of what lay beneath the neat flower beds, made sleep an elusive luxury. Every rustle, every whisper of the night wind sent jolts of terror through me. Days turned into weeks. The horror of my discovery began to blend into the fabric of my everyday life. The quiet suburban neighborhood, the friendly chats with neighbors, the serene evenings, all bore the taint of George's secret. The realization that the most terrifying horrors weren't hidden away in some remote corners, but were nestled right next to us, was a hard pill to swallow. One night, as I lay in bed, sleep eluding me, I heard it again. The soft rustling of leaves, the crunching of soil, the telltale signs of George's nocturnal gardening. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I wanted to shut my eyes, to pretend I was somewhere else, somewhere safe. But I couldn't. I rose from my bed, driven by a morbid curiosity, a need to confront the reality. I peered through my window, the familiar sight of George in his garden greeting me. There he was, engrossed in his disturbing routine, oblivious to the sleepless eyes watching him. Gripped by a sense of foreboding, I watched as George worked meticulously in his garden. The moonlight fell onto the scene, casting eerie shadows and accentuating the grim reality of the situation. The harmless man next door was anything but, and the chilling truth was a constant specter. The days of peaceful suburban living seemed a distant memory. The terror had permeated every aspect of my life. Each interaction with George was a chilling reminder of the secret I carried, the knowledge of the horrors that lay beneath the surface of normalcy. I wrestled with my conscience, debating whether to expose George's gruesome secret, Fear held me back. The fear of bringing his macabre wrath upon me. But the guilt of knowing and doing nothing was unbearable. The next day, under the guise of a normal day, I made my decision. I would confront George. The anticipation was a cold knot in my stomach, gnawing at my sanity. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I walked over to George's house. "George," I began, my voice wavering. I know about your garden." His reaction was not one of shock or anger. Instead, he simply stared at me, a knowing smile playing on his lips.
"Ah, neighbor,"
he said, his voice eerily calm.
"I had a feeling you would. I'm not sure what you think you know."
George continued, leaning against his garden rake. His calm demeanor was chilling, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me.
"It's just a garden after all."
"Just a garden?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "George, I found a finger in your garden." The words hung heavily in the air, a damning accusation against the man standing before me. His smile didn't waver. His eyes didn't betray any signs of guilt or fear. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, his gaze never leaving mine.
"Is that what's been keeping you up at night, neighbor?"
he asked, his tone mocking.
"You found a finger in my garden, and now you think I'm some sort of... what? A monster?"
His words were a slap to my face, a cruel joke that left me reeling. The horror of the reality of the man standing before me and his grave secret was a bitter pill to swallow. I don't know what you are, George," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "But I know what I found, and I know it's not normal." George's laughter echoed in the quiet neighborhood, a sinister sound that sent shivers down my spine. He stepped closer, his gaze piercing through me.
"Oh, neighbor,"
he said, his voice soft, almost gentle.
"Normal is just a facade. What lies beneath? Now that's the real horror, isn't it?"
His words reverberated through the quiet evening air, a harsh reminder of the gruesome reality I was trapped in. I stared at him, his calm demeanor, his nonchalant attitude, and I felt a cold dread creep into my heart. I was standing face to face with a monster hiding behind the facade of a harmless man.
"But you know,"
he continued, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper,
"you've got it all wrong. The finger, it's not what you think."
A spark of hope ignited within me. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was all a big misunderstanding. But the cruel smile that played on his lips crushed that hope instantly.
"It's not a victim,"
he clarified, his words punctuated by the chilling laughter that followed.
"It's a souvenir."
A souvenir. The word echoed in my mind, the horrifying implication of his confession sending a chill down my spine. I took a step back, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. I was dealing with a man who treated human remains as souvenirs.
"I think it's time for you to leave, neighbor,"
George said, his tone final.
"I have work to do."
I turned and fled, his chilling words echoing in my ears. As I reached the safety of my house, I looked back. George was already back in his garden, absorbed in his gruesome pastime. The quiet suburban neighborhood was no longer a haven. It was a stage for a horrifying show, a show where the antagonist was a seemingly harmless man next door. And I, a sleepless neighbor, was the unwilling audience, trapped in the nightmare with no end in sight. That night, sleep was a distant dream. Every creak, every rustle of the wind was a haunting reminder of George and his horrific secret. The safety of my home felt violated, tainted by the knowledge of the monstrosity that lurked next door. Days turned into weeks, and the horror became a part of my existence. The neighborhood, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now wore the mask of terror. Every glance at George's house, every sight of him tending to his garden was a punch to my gut. I was trapped, torn between the fear of exposing George's secret and the guilt of staying silent. I tried to carry on, to pretend everything was normal, but the nights were a constant battle, a struggle against the terror that lurked in the shadows. The question of the finger, of the grave secret, gnawed at me. the seemingly harmless man next door was a monster, and I was the only one who knew it. Yet I was helpless, a prisoner of my own fear. In the end, I did the only thing I could. I moved away, leaving behind the quiet suburban neighborhood and its hidden horrors. I left George, the man with the grave secret, behind. But the memory of his garden, of the finger of his chilling confession, was a scar that refused to heal. The horror of the reality of the seemingly harmless man next door and his grim secret was a stark reminder of the truth. The most terrifying horrors weren't hidden away in some remote corners, but were nestled right next to us, beneath the surface of normalcy. And so, I carry on, forever haunted by the memory of the quiet suburban neighborhood and its chilling secret. The fear, the guilt, and the knowledge of the horror that lurked next door is a burden I bear alone. And somewhere in a quiet suburban neighborhood, George continues his nocturnal gardening, his grave secret buried beneath the flower beds. The horror remains, a grim reminder of the monsters that walk among us, hiding behind the facade of normalcy.